Actually, I kind of like this time of year when we get through the heart of winter. Now we're getting where the days are in the 20s and we're getting a little more daylight. It's the time to go out ice fishing and doing other things that are manly and Alaskan and very fun to do. It reminds me of course, we have fishermen in the gospel today, so it makes sense, right? It's very timely. And it reminds me of this particular guy who's an angler. Let's just say he was overserved one day and decided to go ice fishing. So he grabbed his gear, stepped out onto the ice, started to cut a whole little hole, when he hears this big booming voice. "There are no fish under the ice." Looks around, doesn't see anybody. So he kind of moves over to a different spot. And then he starts cutting a little hole in the ice again with his auger. Again, the big booming voice comes from above. "There are no fish under the ice." Holy cow. So still nobody. He didn't know if he was going kind of nuts or something. So he stumbles to a new spot, starts drilling another hole when the voice shouts out a third time, "There are no fish under the ice." And he looks up and sees a blinding light. He says, "Is that you, Lord?" He says, "No, it is the manager of the ice rink." So, anyway, so we want that though, don't we sometimes? We want the Lord to speak directly to us. We want that just like we see in the beginning at the first reading with the call of Isaiah. In fact, there are three vocation stories. I'm going to concentrate on two. We have the call of Isaiah, and that's contrasted with the call of Peter and James and John, primarily Peter in the Lucan version of it here. And you could really call it the tale of two vocations, but we want God to act powerfully like that, but it doesn't always work that way with us. Now, rest assured, God can act powerfully and does act powerfully at times, but you notice he never does so violently. God never does violence to us. And remember that. Remember that. And I think if we look at that, the call of the first disciples in today's gospel, reading from Luke, and especially Peter. And while I'm convinced that this is not the first time that these four disciples have encountered Jesus, nevertheless, the way he enters Simon Peter's life shows us how God takes him and his companions where they are and invites them into what they are called to be. And he does the same thing with each one of us, too, if you think about it. So let's kind of pull that apart, shall we? Let's look at this gospel passage. Just look at a couple of the parts about it, see if we can gain some insight. Well, so here we go. Jesus arrives on the scene, and what are Peter, James, and John doing? They're just finishing up the night's work. They're doing something they do every day. But again, so what's going on here? Now remember, fishermen in that part of the world would work at night, and they would have these long poles they would attach to the boat, and they would shine them out, and they would take a lantern at the end of the pole and put it out over the water. That would attract the fish to the surface. And then they have this casting net, this weighted net that splays out and would go down, and that's how they would capture the fish. And it was hard. It was repetitive work. And no doubt they were pretty tuckered out when Jesus arrived. And they may or may not. I imagine, let's get a good meal. Let's stow the gear, get a good meal, take a snooze, and then get ready for the next night. And, they may not have been expecting Jesus to stop by at the end of the workday. But like all of Israel in those days, they were expecting the Messiah and the coming of the Messiah. And they saw in him something that resembled that and recognized that in him. So what does Jesus ask Peter to do? He shows up in the middle of the workday, just kind of, and Peter's not doing anything outrageous at this point. And he makes a very simple, very small request. Just, let's take the boat. Can I borrow your boat so we can get a better vantage point to teach the people? So what's going on here? When we go to the Holy Land, and those of you who are going to go on the trip, and I think there's still time, and that's one of the things, once I get back from vacation, I've got back from vacation, so you're going to see more on that now. But we'll go to the Holy Land, and we will go to this place, or one very much like it. And what you'll see there in that area is that there's this little cove that forms a natural amphitheater, probably about twice the size of this church. So imagine that this is the water and this is the cove, and this amphitheater goes up from behind, and just the grass, just sort of grassy slopes that come down, and it's a natural amphitheater. You put a boat 30 yards out in the center of that cove, everybody in that amphitheater can hear you perfectly. It's really a slick deal, because you know how voice carries over water, and then so it works perfectly in this part, in that part. The geography is just perfect. And Peter, Andrew, and Peter, James, and John probably have spent the day with Jesus earlier, so it's an easy favor to grant. I often kind of imagine what it would be like to be Peter sitting in the boat while Jesus is doing the teaching. He's preaching the kingdom. They don't get into the specifics of what he was teaching here. We get that later. But can you imagine sitting there in the boat with Jesus as he's teaching the crowd? Because you get to see the crowd and the reactions on their faces. Pretty cool. Pretty neat. Pretty neat. But even so, Peter is very much in his comfort zone, isn't he? He's not doing anything strange. He's not doing anything outrageous. He's just doing what he's been doing all the time, just running the boat. And they're in the shallows. There's no risk here. There's nothing going on. There's no risk. But, Jesus has something greater in store for Simon, doesn't he? And the others. So his command to set out into the deep seems really off. Just futile. I mean, Simon knows his business. Fishing in daylight is futile in those waters. The fish simply aren't there. It's like fishing for salmon on the Kenai in early April. You ain't going to get any. They're just not there yet. But I imagine he figured it wouldn't hurt, to humor the carpenter turned rabbi. So it's nothing really. Think about it. Jesus is not asking him to do anything he's never done before. The timing might be off, but this is what Peter does for a living. He takes boats out in the deep and he casts the nets. So what's the difference? The only difference this time is that Jesus is with him. And that makes all the difference. And I think there's a lesson for all of us here. Because so often when we're trying to discern the will of God, we expect him to act powerfully from the outset. Sort of like that scene from the call of Isaiah, where where he's taken up to heaven, and the temple is shaking, and the room is filled with smoke, and there's the one seated on a throne. Seraphim were frightening creatures, by the way. 6 wings, fiery. It was pretty. Oh, and then woe is me! I'm a man of unclean lips. Well, he was right, and we see that's Peter's reaction too. But we want that. We want the sign from God, don't we? We want the voice from the heavens. We want the bright light. But I'll be honest with you, you couldn't handle it. It'd be too much. It's overwhelming. And so God works with us where we are, as we are, and helps us and invites us into what we are called to be. That's exactly what he does with Peter. Christ is much gently with us and was much gently with Peter. Remember, he wasn't asking Peter to do anything he had never done before. The difference was that now he was on the scene. And that made all the difference in how Peter's life turned out after that. And that should be the good lesson for us. When we understand that there's no part of our life then, that God just isn't present in the strange, outrageous, the bombastic, the liturgical, if you will. But there's no part of our life where God is not present. When we understand that God works in the mundane of our lives, then our entire life becomes blessed, and that makes all the difference. Not necessarily, life isn't about doing outrageous things. It might be doing the normal things, but the only difference is that Jesus is with us. And that's the key. It's not doing outrageous things. It's doing very normal things with an extraordinary love. Christ takes us where we are and invites us into what we are called to be. He prepares us to recognize him acting in little ways so that we will not be overwhelmed when he does, through those little ways, act in very profound ways. There is no part of our life that is separated from God. And I guess my prayer for all of us, and the lesson for all of us, is that we be vigilant in prayer, we be vigilant in the sacraments, we be vigilant in the life of the church, in putting our gifts, our time, our talent, our treasure at the disposal of others, so that our hearts will be open to him in the mundane, so that we can recognize him and follow him in the profound and invite others to do so.